In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at the so-called Pentagon Papers. This massive collection of documents was a detailed history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The leaking of the Pentagon Papers had negative effects on the perceptions by many Americans toward the war, and it also, as we will see, had significant political ramifications as well. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara launched what was known as the Vietnam Study Task Force in 1967. One of the stated goals of the group was to compose what was termed as an encyclopedic history of the Vietnam War. The original name of the report produced was United States-Vietnam Relations 1945 to 67. You can see an example of one volume here on this slide. The study contains a total of 47 volumes and encompasses some 7,000 pages of text. The report contained information demonstrating that a succession of American presidents, but particularly Lyndon Johnson, had been less than truthful about American involvement in Vietnam, and I'm being diplomatic here, some would say outright lies. The report also concluded that the Vietnam War was unlikely to be winnable at costs that Americans would politically accept. Historians and political scientists continue to debate McNamara's intentions in ordering the development of what became known as the Pentagon Papers. McNamara himself wrote he planned to create a documentary historical source that would help future leaders from repeating policy mistakes of the Johnson administration. It should be noted that McNamara failed to apprise either President Johnson or Secretary of State Dean Rusk about the report's existence, as well as numerous other, including the National Security Advisor, about the report. Some scholars have suggested that McNamara intended to make the Pentagon Papers available to perhaps Robert F. Kennedy, with whom he was friends, either as policy analysis or in a more sinister sense as potential campaign research with which to attack the Johnson administration. About 36 military and policy analysts worked on the study. Some of these individuals were experienced military officials, while civilian scholars and federal employees also contributed to the report. Most of the documentation was obtained from the Defense Department. Analysts did not conduct interviews with government or military officials as part of an effort to maintain the study's secrecy. Pictured on this slide is Leslie Gelb, the Defense Department official who supervised much of the project. Daniel Ellsberg was an economist who earned his PhD at Harvard and who had worked on parts of the Pentagon Papers, specifically on Vietnam policy in the early years of the Kennedy administration. Ellsberg had extensive military experience prior to working for the Pentagon, and he had spent approximately 2 years in Vietnam working under General Edward Lansdale in the State Department. The image on this slide is of Ellsberg in 1954 when he was a lieutenant in the Marine Corps. After his work in the Pentagon, Ellsberg went back to work for the RAND Corporation, which is a think tank that has long influenced American foreign policy. Ellsberg's work at the RAND Corporation put him in a position of contact with a number of important Nixon administration officials. However, he grew discouraged that Kissinger and other Nixon policy advisors seemed to be ignoring the recommendations in what would become known as the Pentagon Papers, and the conclusions, more importantly, that the war was not winnable. At an August 1969 peace rally, Ellsberg claimed to have suddenly realized that if made public, the report could bring about enough pressure to finally end U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Through his RAND Corporation connections, Ellsberg had access to the report that he once contributed to the development of. Ellsberg and a fellow RAND researcher, Anthony Russo, Xeroxed the study in 1969 with the goal of making the report public. They initially approached members of Congress trying to get the document entered into the congressional record, and there were no senators willing to do so. So they contacted the press, and the New York Times began publishing selections of these so-called Pentagon Papers. On June 13th of 1971, Ellsberg and Russo are depicted in this 1971 photograph. Ellsberg's wife is on the right-hand side of the picture. I'm not sure who the person is in between those two individuals there with the longer hair. Initially, the Nixon administration was kind of ambivalent about the leak of the Pentagon Papers, as the report did not cover the time period of the Nixon administration, and in some ways was highly critical of Lyndon Johnson. And Nixon, again, initially thought, well, this doesn't really harm us, and in fact might even help us politically, since it shows that we were right, that our predecessor had poor policies. However, Nixon's advisors quickly changed their tune, particularly Kissinger, recognizing the leaking of the report as a possible precedent for future leaks, a possible catalyst for increasing anti-war sentiment in the United States. And Kissinger also had an interesting angle in terms of negotiations with the Chinese. He believed that if Nixon did not respond in a forceful manner, that the Chinese, with whom they were negotiating at the time, would not take him seriously as a powerful leader. Whether that's true or not is another story, but that's what Kissinger believed. Nixon ordered the Justice Department to investigate. In a June 29, 1971 phone call to Attorney General John Mitchell, Nixon declared that, now here's a spoiler alert or a profanity alert, so if you're easily offended by profanity, even though I'm quoting the historical record, I'm giving you a couple of seconds to turn down the not safe for work slightly comment that Nixon made. Here it is. "We've got to get this son of a bitch." End quote. The Nixon administration first obtained court injunctions barring publication of the Pentagon Papers. However, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 against the Nixon administration in a landmark case, arguing that the government lawyers had failed to prove that national security concerns outweighed the First Amendment rights of American newspapers. In a bizarre twist, the Ellsberg case prompted Nixon to order the creation of the notorious group known as the White House Plumbers. As a little bit of background, Nixon did not feel the FBI would do his bidding the way he wished, and he created this quasi-security group. The Plumbers' first job was to break into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in an attempt to discover information that would be embarrassing to Ellsberg and perhaps use to threaten him. The operatives, after breaking into the Los Angeles office of the psychiatrist, reported they could not find Ellsberg's file. The psychiatrist, though, the morning after the burglary, found the file on the floor and claimed that it appeared the file had been opened and read. So there's some dispute as to what was seen and what was not seen. I've read some of the accounts of the burglars, and they claimed that they didn't find anything. But again, this particular file was out in the open and on the floor. It begs credibility that no one read it. The Plumbers themselves would go on to, I guess, greater infamy for the connections to the Watergate break-in and cover-up in 1972. After a short period of going into hiding, Ellsberg surrendered to federal authorities in Boston in June 29th, 1971. He was charged under the Espionage Act, specifically with theft and unauthorized possession of classified documents. Russo was subpoenaed a few months later in August to appear before a federal grand jury, and he ended up getting jailed for several weeks when he refused to testify against Ellsberg. Additional indictments were handed down against the two. In December 1971, Ellsberg, if convicted of all charges, faced a possible sentence of up to 115 years in prison, while Russo was looking at as much as 35 years in prison. On May 11, 1974, the judge in the Pentagon Papers trial dismissed all charges against Ellsberg and Russo. The judge noted that the, quote, conduct of the government has placed the case in such a posture that it precludes the fair, dispassionate resolution of these issues by a jury, specifically pointing out that the break-in of the office of the psychiatrist in terms of the violation of the rights of Ellsberg. The judge also ordered that no future charges could be brought against Ellsberg and Russo following the same legal tack that the government had followed earlier. The initial effect of the Pentagon Papers was growing cynicism of ordinary Americans toward their government, especially the executive branch. Never before in American history had such direct proof been published of intentional deception by the government. And prior to this period, most Americans believed propaganda, government propaganda, that leaks of government documents were typically the work of foreign agents and that such leaks were likely altered or manipulated to make the government look bad, and that people shouldn't pay attention to this stuff. Here, though, were thousands of pages of evidence penned by government employees, and the federal government, interestingly in the case, never even attempted to claim the evidence was falsified, just that it shouldn't be released. So once it finally was released, and perhaps they didn't think this through as well as they did, or maybe they were overconfident of their ability to control the outcome. But the case also led to greater willingness by media outlets to question and even expose government wrongdoing at the federal level. Certainly the Watergate case would not have proceeded the way it had this ground had not been broken by the Ellsberg case. This brings to a conclusion our brief look at the Pentagon Papers.